The following video contains multiple true horror stories told by different people from different places and different times. Each story is separate. Each story is real. Some are disturbing. All of them stayed with the people who lived through them. Story 1. The chemical plant night shift. When I was much younger, I worked as a security guard at a chemical plant back in my home country of Mexico. And since I did not flatter my boss the way some of the other guards did, I was assigned to night shifts all the time. At first, I thought I would hate it, but after a couple of weeks, I realized it was not just easy. It was quiet, almost peaceful. Some of the other guards said it unsettled them to spend the night around a shut-down factory. I did not mind it at all, not until I found those kids. Just over a year into the job, one of the bar gates at the plant's front entrance developed a minor malfunction. It could have been a local teenager who damaged it, or maybe someone figured it out or overheard something somewhere. The bar did not fully lock when it came down. That meant someone could stop, get out, lift the bar, and let a second person drive the car straight into the plant. The first time I saw a car parked near the back of the facility, I shined my flashlight on it, and it took off toward the front gate at full speed. I chased it around to the front, knowing they would have to stop and lift the bar. But I was not fast enough, and they got away. I assumed it was a group of drug addicts trying to steal whatever they could carry. But a few nights later, when I spotted another car, I crept up and witnessed something else entirely. There were two teenagers, a boy and a girl, kissing each other as if it were their last night on Earth. All I wanted to do was tell them to leave, but they were so embarrassed that they bolted like a pair of frightened animals. The newest town was deeply conservative and Catholic, and many of those kids' fathers worked at the plant. Because of that, they did not want rumors of their behavior spreading through the locker rooms. And most nights, all it took was a slow wave of my flashlight for the cars to vanish without a trace. Then came the night when my little trick failed. When I shined my flashlight on a trespassing car, it did not move. I figured it was only a matter of time before I faced some resistance from one of the kids. News of a good makeout spot traveled fast among high schoolers back then. It likely still does today. So I figured that sooner or later I would run into a couple of kids who just would not leave at the sight of my flashlight. I walked toward the car, giving them a friendly warning that they did not have to go home, but they could not stay there. The engine was off, and I assumed the sound of my voice would get it started, but it did not. I kept walking toward the back of the car, and since I could see people inside through the rear window, I called out again and told them to leave. It feels foolish to admit now, but when they did not respond that time either, I started to feel frustrated. As I reached the passenger window, I raised my voice and said, "I am talking to you." The kids inside that old car could not hear a single word I was saying, because both of them were dead. The boy in the driver's seat was only sitting upright because the wire he had been strangled with was tied to the headrest. His tongue was hanging out, and his face and hands looked bright blue in the beam of my flashlight. The girl beside him looked like she had been stabbed in the side of the neck. There was a large amount of dried blood covering her left side and smeared across the center console as well. It was the worst thing I had ever seen in my life, not just because of how bloody it was or because I had not expected to find two bodies, but because their eyes were wide open when I found them. The girl's were half closed. She looked almost sleepy, but the boy's eyes were nearly bulging out of their sockets. That final look of terror at death was preserved for me to see. I ran to the plant security office and called the police. A short time later, a single officer drove over from the town precinct to check on what I had reported. By the time my shift ended, the area behind the plant surrounding the car had become a crime scene. Several officers were walking around, while a police photographer took pictures of the bodies. The guy who replaced me asked if I was all right, because he must have seen how shaken I was. I told him I was fine. I said I just needed a day off to drink and forget. But no matter how hard I tried, I could not shake the image of those two kids sitting in that car. After that, every time I did a foot patrol around the plant, I found myself lingering near the spot where I used to find the cars. It took me a long time to admit it, but I was truly haunted by what I saw that night. I found a security job somewhere else in the months that followed. About a year later, I moved to Arizona with my heavily pregnant wife. Tucson is crazy in its own way, but it is my home now. And while all kinds of terrible things happen on this side of the border too, I have faith that the police actually want to do something about the crimes that happen here. I cannot say the same for my country of birth. It feels strange to think that seeing something so horrific was the beginning of my journey to the U.S. But it also reminds me of something my abuelita used to say when I was growing up. She used to say, "There is no evil from which good does not come." Story 2. This is the story of a young mother who realized someone was watching her life far too closely. My name is Lauren Hale. I am almost 30 and I went through a deeply stressful and frightening period last year. In April of that year, I was lying in bed, scrolling through Instagram, when a message request suddenly appeared in my DMs. I sometimes get scammers sending suspicious links, and I usually block them without thinking. This time, though, the profile looked legitimate, and the message simply said, "Hi." I decided to take a closer look at the profile. When I did, I saw it belonged to a woman who lived in the same city as me. Since we appeared to be around the same age, I thought there might be some kind of connection. I replied, "Sorry, do we know each other?" and added a small smiley face so it would not come across as rude. About 2 minutes later, a reply came through. When I opened it, I realized it was not a text message, but a voice note that was nearly a minute long. I had no real reason not to press play. I had heard of scammers calling elderly people and pretending to be the IRS, but nothing about them sending voice messages. So I pressed play, and I immediately wished I had not. The first words were, "Hello, Lauren Hale." As soon as I heard them, a heavy, sinking feeling ran through my entire body, and I felt like I wanted to disappear into the mattress and hide. The voice was clearly not human. It sounded like some very basic AI, almost robotic. Maybe hearing it in another situation would not have been so frightening, but hearing it alone in bed with only my 7-year-old daughter sleeping in the room next door terrified me. It continued, "Hello, Lauren Hale. I have been watching you for quite some time, and I have decided you have to die. Not just you, your daughter has to die too." It went on, describing how someone would force me to watch while they killed her, followed by more details that made my stomach turn. What frightened me the most, what made me rush to the window and scan the street outside, was when the voice began describing the house we lived in. It was not limited to the house. Whoever created that recording knew what my daughter looked like. He knew her name, and he knew which elementary school she attended. The message ended with a few more threats about how he was going to die, and it signed off by saying, "To enjoy my final days," because he was going to enjoy ending them. When the message ended, I lay there for a minute, wondering what I should do. I knew I needed to call the cops, but I also knew all they would do was take my report and be on their way. I needed someone to come over and stay with me, someone who could make me feel safe. So I called Mark Nolan. Mark Nolan and I had been dating on and off for about a year, and while we had officially broken up a few months earlier, we somehow slipped back into the same old dating pattern. Mark Nolan was close with my daughter. My dad liked him, and he was pretty handy with repairs and maintenance too. So it was nice to have him around. The only issue was his drinking, because when he drank, he became a completely different person. Someone I did not want around my daughter. and he refused to quit outright. He cut back a lot, which was the reason I still took his calls or spent time with him. And when I got that voice message that night, he was the first person I thought to call. He drove over as quickly as he could. So maybe 20 minutes after I called him, he was sitting in my TV room, letting me cry on his shoulder. I did not want to hear the voice message again, so he took my phone into another room to listen to it. And when he came back, he looked like a mix of genuinely scared and genuinely angry. He told me we needed to call the cops, and while I already knew that, he gave me a lot of hope by talking about all the new techniques they had to catch cyber stalkers. 10 years earlier, they would have told me to block the person and move on, but now they had entire departments dedicated to tracing and arresting those responsible. He said he had watched a documentary about it a while back, and that if I went to the cops, we could stop it before things spiraled out of control. I told him he could sleep on the couch if he wanted to, but he did not. He spent the rest of the night watching the street outside and reading about the experiences of others who had dealt with cyber stalking to give us ideas on how to fight it. He had to work in the morning too, and while I called in sick, Mark Nolan pushed through before coming back to check on us once he clocked out. I called the cops that morning, and a few days later, they sent over a detective who worked exclusively with victims of cyber stalking. She laid out exactly what I was supposed to do, and fortunately, it did not include any of the delete, block, and move on advice I had been worried about. It was the complete opposite, because the detective explained how I needed to keep records of every message. I had to save every voice note, every text I received, and all the usernames from the different accounts my stalker was using to harass me. And they harassed me relentlessly. The fresh Instagram accounts came thick and fast, each one sending what looked like innocent messages, so the app did not filter them out. But I knew that as soon as I accepted a message request, a voice note would arrive, and the same process repeated itself every time. I did not listen to any of them. I kept them in my inbox so the police would be able to. But my stalker must have realized I was not listening, because they quickly changed their methods. Late one night, just as I was finishing my skincare routine, I noticed I had a missed call from an unknown number. It was not a no-caller ID number, just one I did not recognize. Because they called so late, I assumed it was important enough to check the voicemail they left. The detective I had spoken to had called me outside of normal hours once or twice, so I thought it might be someone from the department trying to reach me before bedtime. But it was not. It was another one of those robotic voice messages. I only listened for a few seconds before hanging up, but that was all I needed. I broke down crying and then called Mark Nolan to see if he could come over again. Just like the first time, he drove over as fast as he could to be my shoulder to cry on. He was incredible that night. I cried so loudly that it woke my daughter, and she was crying too by the time he arrived. The first thing he did was calm her down and get her back into bed, telling her that everything was going to be just fine. The next morning, Mark Nolan drove my daughter to school while I called the cyberstalking detective. I gave her the phone number the voicemail came from and said maybe she could trace it or something. She thanked me and said that sometimes cyberstalkers get bored and move on to someone else. But my stalker did not get bored. Instead, they escalated. At first, I actually thought things were getting better because the number of Instagram messages slowed down a little, and I did not receive any more voicemails. Then one night, around the same time both voice messages had arrived before, I heard an extremely loud banging on my door. It was not someone trying to be heard. Someone was trying to scare me. I was upstairs when it happened, drying off after a shower, and my daughter was staying with my mom, who had volunteered to take care of her while things settled down. I was grateful she was there that night, because the banging terrified me. I slammed my bedroom door shut and sat against it after grabbing my phone. This time, I did not call Mark Nolan first. I called the police. I told the dispatcher I had a stalker and that I believed he had escalated and come to my house for the first time. The dispatcher asked if I feared for my life. When I said that I did, she sent 2 patrol cars to check the area. The entire time, whoever was outside kept pounding on my door while the dispatcher stayed on the line with me. Then, all at once, the banging stopped. The next thing I heard was the police sirens. Just a short burst to let me know they had arrived. The dispatcher asked if I could hear them, and when I said yes, she told me to stay where I was while the 2 officers checked the outside of my property. A few minutes later, the dispatcher said she was ending the call and instructed me to go downstairs and open the door for the officers. I thanked her and did exactly as she said. The next day was Saturday, but I was able to speak briefly with the cyber-stalking detective over the phone. She told me it would be best if I stayed somewhere else for a while, which is how I ended up sleeping in my mom's spare bedroom with my daughter. That small reunion felt like a silver lining, but it didn't last long, because when I returned home later to grab more clothes, I discovered that someone had broken in. It didn't look like anything had been stolen, and nothing had been smashed. But when I walked into the kitchen, I saw that someone had pinned a note to the fridge. It was printed, not handwritten, and all it said was, "I see you," followed by a text message smiley face emoji. That was probably the worst part of that whole period for me, knowing I couldn't go back home. I leaned heavily on my mom for support, and Mark Nolan was a huge help too. He offered to let me and my daughter stay at his place, but I felt it was more comforting for her to be around her grandmother. It also meant we had a place where we could be alone, Mark Nolan and me, which was something we both appreciated. That's how I lived for almost 2.5 weeks, until the cyber-stalking detective suddenly called one day and asked if she could come see me. We arranged to meet at my mom's place, and when she arrived, she told me she had good news and bad news. The good news was that the police had found my stalker. I could barely contain my relief in that moment. I remember sitting there with a wide smile after she told me, but the detective didn't seem to share my reaction. She explained that my stalker had been careful and had used a lot of technical tricks to make almost everything they did untraceable. They made one fatal mistake, though, because when they downloaded the pictures of the girl I thought I might have known, the one from the first voice message, he failed to remove the metadata. That allowed the police to trace where the images were uploaded from, and that was how they caught him. The detective then explained that they were planning to arrest my stalker that same day, but before they did, they wanted me to hear the news directly from them, rather than through the grapevine. I wanted her to tell me who it was so badly that I didn't stop to consider why learning their identity might be bad news for me. Then she said it. "There's no easy way to say this, Lauren Hale, and I'm so sorry to be the one who has to tell you, but the person stalking you is your friend, Mark Nolan." My mind went completely blank for a moment, and when I could finally form a coherent thought, I decided she must have been confused somehow. I reminded her that Mark Nolan was my ex-boyfriend, someone I'd been extremely close with, and that we were actually on the verge of getting back together because he'd been so helpful and supportive. I told her she had to be mistaken, and I clearly remember the look of pity she gave me afterward. She went back over some of what she'd said about how they'd figured out it was him. They explained that if it wasn't Mark Nolan who had created the first Insta profile on his computer, then they needed to find out who had. That gave me a small ray of hope that it was all just a huge mistake and not someone I loved who had been terrorizing me. But once the cops went to Mark Nolan's place and told him he was facing jail time, he confessed to everything after they took him to the station. It only felt real after the detective came by again and showed me the video of Mark Nolan confessing in the interview room. But there was one part she said would be of particular interest to me. It was the part where Mark Nolan explained why he did it. He sounded like he'd been crying as he told the officer interviewing him that he did it because, in his words, she'd need me. The cop sounded sympathetic, but the detective swore it was just an act to get Mark Nolan to keep talking. She also said that since Mark Nolan had no priors and cooperated fully, he most likely wasn't going to prison. He'd probably be able to make bail as well. But the judge at his hearing would issue an emergency restraining order, preventing him from coming anywhere near me. And if he did, he'd go straight to jail to await trial there. That was the first good news I'd heard in a very long time. Real good news, I mean. Of course, I wanted Mark Nolan out of my life. I wanted to forget I had ever met him. And it made me sick to think that we'd slept together while he was secretly turning my life into a living hell. Thankfully, once all our friends found out what he'd done, Mark Nolan ended up leaving town and moving somewhere across the country. It felt good knowing the whole thing had ruined his life, just like it had ruined mine for a while. And wherever he ended up, I hope he rots there. Story 3. What began as an ordinary day in Birmingham quickly became a terrifying encounter with criminals posing as police officers. My name is Thomas Reed, and in 2008 I was working for a large insurance firm in Birmingham. We sold insurance to major construction companies, and I was paid very well for what was essentially a junior position. I was living the dream. I was young, single, and had a lot of disposable income, even by London standards. Then the Big Short hit, and everything collapsed. I lost my job just days after the market fell apart. I had a bit of savings put aside, so I wasn't as desperate as some others. But as the months passed and the job market failed to recover, that small nest egg kept shrinking. Once I became eligible, I applied for job seekers allowance, which meant I received money from the government as long as I could prove I was looking for work. But it only went so far, and my savings continued to drain as I waited for another finance role. Finally, when things started to look serious, I did something very stupid. I got in touch with an old friend of mine named Lewis Grant and asked him for a big favor. Lewis Grant and I had been close all through school, but we drifted apart once we went to university because Lewis Grant got heavily into weed. He wasn't irresponsible about it. He had a proper job and everything. But after work, he would zone out, smoke a lot of weed, and play GTA 4, while I never touched the stuff. I hated the idea of what smoking might do to my lungs. So it's easy to imagine Lewis Grant's surprise when I called him one day and asked if he could get me some weed. I went over, and after we caught up for a bit, I started questioning him about how much weed he smoked each week, how much it cost, and where he got it from. He asked if I wanted to try smoking for the first time, but I said no and told him I wanted to try selling it instead. I'll never forget his expression. He genuinely couldn't believe what he was hearing. But after I explained my money problems and said it was only meant to be temporary while I was out of work, it began to make more sense to him. We talked late into the night about nearly every aspect of the trade. Lewis Grant had never sold weed himself, but he knew a fair amount about it. After calling his dealer to get approval, Lewis Grant gave me the number, and we arranged a meeting. I started selling a few ounces a week to Lewis Grant and a few of his friends that I knew personally, keeping it to that small group so things stayed controlled, safe, and profitable. After a while, though, they persuaded me to let people I didn't know come by. I was dead against it at first. But when I did the math and realized that I was earning hundreds more each week with just a few extra customers, I changed my mind fast. By the time my customer base hit double figures, I was able to cover the cost of everything job seekers allowance would not, which took a massive weight off my shoulders. I kept up with my job-seeking commitments, though. I genuinely wanted to get back into work, but I did not think anything would come along for quite a while. Then one day, just as the markets started to recover, I landed a job. The pay was not as generous as my first job before the crash, and I was facing a long probation period. But getting back into the office was better than having to visit the job center every 2 weeks, which was so depressing it used to drain the life out of me. I took the position and carried on selling weed to Lewis Grant and his group until my first payslip arrived. When it did, I tried deleting the dealer's number. I could not bring myself to do it. I was making hundreds of pounds a week for doing next to nothing, and I was doing it in a way I believed was safe and secure. So when it came to giving it up, all I could think was that there was no reason to stop. I sometimes wonder if I had quit right then and there, whether I would have avoided what was coming. Another part of me thinks it would not have mattered, and that it was already too late. Now, cut to around 3 or 4 months after I got back into work, and I was still selling ganja to that small group of customers. It was a Wednesday night, and I had been asleep for about 3 hours, when a sudden noise from downstairs had me jumping out of bed. My alarm clock read 2:03, a number I will never forget, as the same sound came again from downstairs. It was a sharp bang, bang, the sound of a fist slamming into my door. When I reached the top of the stairs, I heard the one thing I had prayed I would never hear. "Police, open up the door." I had feared that moment for months, but I had also done a lot to prepare for it. I had spent so much time thinking about my hiding places that I was confident the police could search my entire house and not find a single banknote or a single baggie. Because of that confidence, I made one of the worst mistakes of my life and walked downstairs to open the door. Before I reached it, the man on the other side gave another loud bang and announced himself as police again. I told him, "All right, I'm coming," and started preparing myself to act innocent. I undid both locks slowly, giving myself time to calm down a little more. When I finally opened the door, I nearly filled my boxers with fear, because it was not the police. It was a group of men in masks, holding tools like weapons. I stared at them for what felt like seconds, though it was probably only a fraction of one, and then I tried to slam the door in their faces, but I was too slow. The man who had been banging shoved his boot into the doorway, stopping me from closing it. Then another one rushed forward to kick the door or slam his shoulder into it, and the next thing I knew, the frame was ripped from my grip, and they were forcing their way inside. I tried running to the kitchen because the back door was there, but I kept that one locked as well. I was still fumbling with the key when one of the men rushed in and grabbed me. I tried to shove him off and fight back, but he had a hammer, and a single blow was enough to make me give up. I ended up with my back against the kitchen door, my hands raised to block another hammer strike, shouting that they could take whatever they wanted if they stopped hurting me. I thought it was just an especially violent burglary, and that once they took my TV and laptop, they would leave. But I was wrong. Completely wrong. They all wore balaclavas and mostly dressed in black or other dark colors. The only way I could tell them apart was by what they carried or the details of their clothes. That was how, when the man with the hammer stepped back, I recognized the one who had been pounding on my door as he moved in. He pointed a wrench at me and told me very clearly that if I didn't cooperate, they would kill me. I just nodded and said, "Yeah, okay." Then he grabbed me by the hair and dragged me into the front room. Once I was there, I saw one of them pull a length of blue plastic cord from the front pocket of his hoodie. I started to panic again, because it was obvious they planned to tie me up. But after a couple more threats, I decided the rope was better than the hammer. I thought they wanted me restrained so I couldn't cause trouble for them. I also wouldn't be able to call the police until long after they were gone. But again, I was wrong. They had other plans for me. They tied my wrists behind my back, then bound my ankles and knees together before pushing me onto the couch. I told them again to take whatever they wanted,
and I thought they would start hauling off the TV and everything else to what I assumed was a van waiting outside.
But instead they began asking me where my stash spots were. For the second time that night, a deep, sick feeling washed over me. It came when I realized that my biggest secret, the one I had worked so hard to protect, wasn't a secret anymore. I tried to play ignorant at first, saying I didn't know what they were talking about, but that didn't work. One of the men started smashing my legs with something heavy, and when I screamed, another clamped his hand over my mouth. They kept hitting me again and again while I screamed into his palm. But when they asked me once more where my stash was, I somehow found the strength to pretend I still didn't know. I suppose it was the thought of losing all that money I had hidden away, which by that point was a couple of thousand, that kept my mouth shut. I was amazed that I even had it in me to withstand a round of torture. But when they turned up the pressure and threatened to start cutting off my toes with a pair of pliers, I broke. I screamed for them to stop as soon as I felt cold metal touch one of my toes, and then I told them exactly where they needed to look to find both my money and the ounce bags of weed I had hidden upstairs. Two of the guys stayed watching over me, while the other ran upstairs to grab everything. I heard him rummaging around for a bit, and then suddenly I heard one of them shout, "Found it!" A few seconds later, they came back downstairs, holding the bags I kept my cash and ganja in. Once the lead bloke was satisfied with everything, he ordered his boys out of the house, but not before telling one of them to put me to sleep. I thought that was it, that they were going to kill me to make sure there were no witnesses. I was almost relieved when I saw the bloke who approached me draw back his fist to punch me. When he did, it landed square on my jaw, and at that moment, everything started to go fuzzy. When I opened my eyes again, the masked men were gone, and the house was quiet. I remembered being robbed, but somehow being tied up had slipped my mind, so it was only when I tried to move that I realized I couldn't. I started to panic again when I realized that even though I'd be missed at work in the next couple of hours, my bosses wouldn't immediately call the police. They would just assume I'd pulled a sick day or something, and if I didn't get myself some help now, I could be stuck in the house for who knows how long, waiting for someone to knock on the door or notice I was missing. Those thoughts scared the hell out of me. Even though it hurt like a bastard to fight against the ropes, I did everything I could to loosen them. It was no use though, and by the time they kept cutting into my wrists, I knew I had to try something else. I ended up hopping over to my home phone, which sat on the coffee table in the back room. I lowered myself onto the floor, kicked it off the table so the handset got a dial tone, and called the only person whose number I knew by heart, the dealer I used to buy from. I had to try a few times because he didn't answer at first, but finally, after feeling my hope shrink to almost nothing, he picked up with a very groggy, "Yo." I told him it was an emergency and that he needed to come over to my place right away. He said he had his kid with him and couldn't make it, and I figured he thought I was after a few fresh ounces. But when I told him what had happened, he said he'd come over as soon as he could. I told him where I had hidden a spare back door key in the garden, and after he hung up, I lay there, praying that he would show up. About half an hour later, I heard someone climbing over the back fence, and that was when I got up and hopped toward the sliding doors in the back room. I felt a deep sense of relief when I saw who stepped into the garden. It was the dealer, true to his word. And after he unlocked the back door, he helped cut away the ropes and free me. I could not stay long. He really did have his kid with him, and she was asleep in the back seat of his car. But after I explained what had happened, he told me that I was lucky. He knew about one man who had come away with a nasty scar across his chest after the gang pressed a hot clothing iron into him, and another who never walked properly again after they smashed one of his knees to pieces. I remember asking him what I was supposed to do next and saying that I could not phone the police, and all he said back was that I should move to the other side of the city if possible, because once they found you, they always came back. And I took his advice, and I moved house as soon as I could. It wrecked me financially, because I was still locked into a contract that I had to fight to get out of. But wild horses could not have stopped me from moving, because there was no way I was going to risk going through that again. I finally stopped selling as well. I had always known that I was not cut out for that life, and that was why I promised myself it would only ever be temporary. But seeing and experiencing the brutal realities up close was something else entirely. There are some very bad men in the world, but it is a comfort to know that I am not one of them. Story 4. Some childhood encounters are so disturbing that they follow you for the rest of your life. Just over 20 years ago, when our daughter was still in diapers, my wife and I moved out of our one-bedroom apartment and into what we called our starter home. It was a 2-bedroom townhouse right on the boundary between the city and the suburbs, and we fell in love with it the moment we attended the viewing. We lived there for almost 10 years, and it was a great place to live, and I have a lot of very happy memories of our daughter's childhood in that house. But it is also the place where I experienced one of the most frightening and disturbing things of my entire life. The street we lived on was a little out of the way, and that meant peace, quiet, and a very low crime rate. It felt serene compared to the neighborhood of our old apartment, and that was a place where you basically had to stay on your toes all the time. So after a few months of living there, I slowly started to let my guard down. I still kept all the doors locked at night, and I still kept my gun ready in its lockbox, but I stopped being so suspicious of crazy neighbors and local weirdos. And it was great. But then, imagine the terror I felt when I woke up in the middle of the night in our peaceful new neighborhood and heard noises coming from downstairs. My wife was asleep next to me, and our daughter was in her crib just a few feet away from our bed. So I knew whoever was downstairs must have broken in somehow. I woke my wife, told her what was going on, and told her to call the cops while I made sure the home invader didn't make it upstairs. Then I went to my closet, took my gun from the lockbox, and crept into the upstairs hallway as quietly as possible. Looking back on it, I can remember the exact moment I changed my mind about what I was going to do. I knew I didn't want to kill anybody because, no matter the circumstances, I didn't want that on my conscience. But I also wanted this mother effer to pay for breaking into my family's home and putting my girls in danger. So that was when I made up my mind to try to surprise them and keep them where they were under pain of death until the cops showed up and arrested them. Once I was maybe 2/3 of the way down the stairs, still creeping quieter than a mouse, I heard noises coming from our kitchen. I figured they'd be in the living room where all the most valuable stuff was. But when I heard sounds from the kitchen, I realized I'd have to move all the way down the first-floor corridor without alerting whoever was there. My heart was thumping like a drum as I walked barefoot along the wooden floor, and I struggled to keep my cool as I heard them moving around. I froze when I heard the faint sound of a chair leg scraping against the linoleum floor, then listened as I heard someone opening and closing cabinets. I guess that should have been a clue that someone was digging through our kitchen cabinets and not our living room with its brand new DVD player. But at the time, I was too hopped up on adrenaline to think about anything other than my plan. And things didn't drop until I peeked around the kitchen doorway. I had my gun ready and was about to tear around that corner like I was in a movie, shouting, "Freeze!" But when I peeked around the corner into the barely lit kitchen, there was just enough light coming through the windows for me to see it wasn't some 6-foot jailbird armed to the teeth. It was a little kid. He was wearing what looked like shorts, but nothing on top, and he was standing on a chair while digging through our snack cabinet. I watched him stuffing the pockets of his shorts with candy and chocolate bars, and as I did, all the anger drained out of me and was replaced by a deep, quiet sadness.
I didn't want to frighten him, not only because he was a kid who, judging by his height, looked no older than 6 or 7, but because I was afraid he might fall off the chair and hit his head on the corner of the kitchen table. I thought about whispering something softly, just to gently get his attention, but I decided that would probably come off as creepy and might scare him even worse than simply calling out to him. Then it occurred to me that I could just switch on the kitchen light. The second I did, the kid's head spun around to look at me, and he froze there, staring. All I said was, "It's okay. It's okay, buddy."
I spoke very softly and told him that it was fine and that he could eat if he was hungry. The kid didn't answer, and even if he had, I'm not sure I would have heard him. I tried to keep my face friendly and calm so I wouldn't alarm him, but once I got a good look at the kid, that smile vanished from my face.
Like I said, the kid was bare-chested and wearing shorts, and he was barefoot as well, with hair cut very short, like someone had given him a buzz cut within the last couple of weeks. What really caught my attention were all the scars covering his chest and arms. They were small enough to be cigarette burns, but they weren't circular, so there was no telling what had caused them. There were a lot of them, maybe 24 spread all over his body. And that wasn't all, because on his face, neck, and right arm were small black symbols. That poor kid had been tattooed. I asked him his name, trying to get him talking and calm him down, but he never spoke, not once. He climbed down from the chair very slowly, his pockets stuffed with candy, and then stood completely still, staring at me. I asked whether he had run away from home. He stayed silent, but his eyes darted toward the pantry by the back door. I couldn't see inside the pantry from where I stood in the kitchen doorway, so when his eyes went there, the first thing that crossed my mind was that he wasn't alone. I jumped back from the kitchen doorway and raised my gun toward the pantry, half expecting the monster who had scarred that kid to come lunging around the corner with a weapon of his own. But the only thing I saw was the kid tearing past my line of sight and running straight into the pantry. I waited a second before moving to peek inside, and when I finally did, the last thing I saw of the kid was his feet wriggling through the doggy door. The doggy door had been installed before we moved in, and since we planned to get a dog in the near future, we had kept it. The whole thing felt so bizarre that if I had woken up right then and found it had all been a dream, I wouldn't have been surprised. But it was real. After taking a few seconds to process everything, I called the cops and told them what had happened. Now, to be clear, I did not call 911 to report a break-in or trespassing or anything like that. I called because I saw a kid who had clearly been subjected to horrific physical abuse. He needed to be found, and he needed to be rescued. Once I told her it was safe and that the cops were stopping by, my wife came downstairs to make some coffee. About an hour later, 2 uniformed cops stopped by, and I told them everything I could about the kid's appearance and how he had acted. One of them asked whether I had noticed anything strange about any of my neighbors, or any behavior that suggested someone might be hiding something. The answer to that was definitely no. I had not met anyone who set off any alarm bells. The cop then suggested that if the kid had been crawling through doggy doors to steal candy, he might have been starving after being on the run for days. That raised the question of who he could have been running from. It also pointed to the kind of person capable of treating a child that way. I wished the cops a lot of luck before I left, because I desperately wanted them to find that kid. More than 20 years later, there is not a single day that goes by when I am not reminded of him in some way. Story 5. This is not a ghost story, but something far more unsettling because it was completely real. Back when I was still a college student living in dorms, I woke up in the middle of the night once to hear an argument unfolding outside my window. It was not especially loud, but it was happening right there outside my room. Since it was a warm night and I had my window open, it woke me up. My first thought was to tell whoever it was to shut the hell up, because it was around 3 a.m. and I had classes the next morning. After I caught what they were fighting about, the gossip side of me suddenly wanted to listen. It was a boy and a girl arguing, mostly in very hushed tones, but every so often the tension would rise, and so would their voices, before one of them shushed the other back down to a whisper. At first, I thought they were a couple. Then I realized they were an ex-couple, and the boy was essentially pleading with the girl for them to get back together. He kept apologizing for something he had never told her, but she did not want to hear it. She called him disgusting, said he should be ashamed of himself, and told him she never wanted to talk to him again. She said that, but there she was, still talking to him, and doing it outside my dorm at 3 a.m. That made me think they were both just as bad as each other. They seemed like one of those toxic couples that should not be together but cannot manage to separate. Since everything was being laid out in the open, I figured I might as well listen. I pulled back the curtains just a little and peeked out, trying to figure out who each of them was. I thought I recognized the girl's voice from somewhere, which meant she likely lived in one of the nearby dorms. I did not recognize the boy's voice at all, so I tried to get a better look at both of them to see who they were. It was dark outside, and the couple were standing right at the edge of the parking lot. They weren't fully lit by the streetlights, and the boy in the couple had his back to me. Without being able to identify them, I kept watching from my window and listening to what they were saying. But they just went around in circles. The boy was trying to explain something in a very low voice. Then, in a slightly louder one, the girl would respond, "I hate you. You disgust me. If I'd known who you really were, I'd never have dated you." It felt like the guy had something he didn't want people to know, which was why he stayed quieter. The girl knew it and was absolutely letting him have it. As she went on a rant about how gross he was, he spun around in frustration, like he was about to walk away. He didn't walk away. Instead, he turned back and punched the girl in the face as hard as he could. The impact was loud, and the sound the girl made when he hit her was so upsetting that I gasped and covered my mouth as she fell to the ground. The boy leaned over her and looked like he was about to hit her again. I went up on my tiptoes so I could yell out the window. I remember saying, "Hey, leave her alone, you piece of crap." He didn't realize he'd been watched the whole time, because the moment he did, the boy started running toward his car and then took off driving like a maniac. My yelling woke up some of the other students, and they were angry about being woken up with classes in the morning. Once I told them what had happened, they came running too. I assumed the boy had knocked the girl completely out with that punch. When we ran outside, we found her having some kind of seizure. That was one of the scariest things I've ever seen, because I was convinced she'd hit her head on the concrete and was going to die because of it. Thankfully, the girl survived with just a concussion, and her ex-boyfriend ended up getting arrested. What stayed with me, even years later, was thinking about that girl and how sickening the sound was that she made after she was punched. Story 6. Late at night, even the smallest mistake can invite something truly terrifying inside. I need to explain something about the room where I work and sleep. It's a ground floor room at the front of a terrace townhouse. There's a small garden just outside my window, which is made up of a large set of 3 bay windows. The left and right windows open from the bottom. When it's unpleasantly hot, which has been often in the UK lately, that creates an opening at a height someone could easily step over and into the room. This usually isn't a problem because I work nights, so I'm only asleep there in the middle of the day. At any other time, it seemed unlikely that someone would climb into an occupied room, and even if they tried, I'd hear and see them open the garden gate and walk up the path to my window. Someone breaking in through the window while I was in the room just didn't feel like a likely or plausible scenario.
That was until a chain of events unfolded that led to exactly that happening. There is one more thing I need to explain first, which is that I do not have curtains hung on these windows. The garden blocks the view from the street, and when the windows were replaced, I simply never paid to have new curtains installed because I genuinely never used them. I hate having airflow into the room blocked, and I hate cutting out natural light. When I sleep during the day, I use a sleep mask, so curtains were never necessary. Then one day, the council replaced the streetlight directly outside my window. What had once been a warm orange glow was swapped for a harsh white spotlight that completely lit up my entire front garden and shone like a floodlight straight through my window. These streetlights are supposed to be fitted with rear guards to prevent light pollution into private property, but they never were. We complained, since all the streetlights in my cul-de-sac were the same, but nothing was ever done. So what I did instead was buy a canvas-printed fold-out screen, and it seemed like the perfect solution. I could open and close it, move it whenever I wanted, and shield whichever parts of the room I chose. And it was far cheaper and far less permanent than hanging curtains. This worked perfectly for a couple of years, until one day, very recently, there was a loud pop outside my window. I was sitting in a chair against the opposite wall of the room, facing the screen, when the pop happened. It took me a moment to realize that the streetlight outside had blown. That was fine by me. That irritating thing had been blasting my room with its overly bright bulb for years, and I was not about to feel sorry for it just because it finally burned out. When my entire power shut off an hour later, though, that was another matter. I sat there in complete, absolute darkness for a while. Eventually, I began to hear the sound of drilling and clanking from a few blocks away, and it became clear that some kind of electrical work was happening. The last time this had happened on my street without warning, the power had been out for 2 hours. That time, it was early evening. This time, it was the middle of the night, just after midnight, and I did not have a torch nearby or anything like that. All I had was my phone, with 48% battery left. I tried reading a Superman comic by the light of my phone for a while, but it quickly became a strain on my eyes. You see, I am disabled and not very steady on my feet, so I really did not want to wander around a pitch-dark house in the middle of the night. Eventually, I turned my phone off, placed the Superman comic on the side table, and simply relaxed in the chair. I have no idea how long I had been asleep when I woke up again. The power was still out, and for a moment, I forgot why everything was so completely dark. When you are used to constant light pollution, having the power cut to an entire street is deeply unsettling, especially when you cannot see 2 feet in front of you, which means you cannot see what is making that scraping and dragging sound. I listened hard. I could faintly see movement in front of me. Was the screen falling over? No. Damn it. No, it was being folded back. In the pitch dark in the middle of the night, someone had climbed in through my window while I was asleep, and they were now standing in the narrow space between the screen and the window itself. I strained as hard as I could to make out anything at all. I thought I could see a hand wrapped around the edge of the screen, but it was almost impossible to be sure. As the screen folded back and exposed the room to the weak light of the crescent moon, there still wasn't much visibility, but it was enough to confirm that someone had climbed through the window and was carefully moving the screen aside. The moon lit them just enough, while I remained in complete darkness on the chair. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I had no idea what kind of thief this was. They could have been armed. It could have been a knife. They looked thin and about average height, and they took 1 or 2 unsteady steps into the room, glancing around as if trying to map a path. My room is pretty cluttered, to put it kindly. so almost immediately they reached out and brushed against a table. I then heard the scrape of their foot nudging a box across the floor. There was no way I was going to sit there in the dark and wait until they noticed me and stabbed me. I had one single option, and I hoped to God that if I took it, things would turn out in my favor. Sitting completely still in the darkness on my chair, I put on my most terrifying horror creator voice and growled, "Get out, before you can't live to regret it." That was it. Either it worked, or I was about to get hit, stabbed, or worse. The figure jolted, crashed into something, and then scrambled straight out through the open window. I felt a flash of sympathy for the poor guy. I think I scared him even more than he scared me. I immediately rushed to the window, turned on my phone's flashlight, and shined it down onto the street. He looked like an older teenager as he ran down the road and disappeared around the corner. I didn't bother calling the police. Maybe I should have, but I knew they wouldn't do much since he had only briefly entered my place and then fled. In that moment, seeing someone peering through my screen in the darkness, I had never been more afraid in my life. And I knew for certain that I would be far more careful about leaving my window open from then on.